Hi, everyone. We're doing another webinar of understanding imaginative writing today. I already see that we have a lot of attendees here. Anya's back, Anjali's here, Davia is here, Jeffrey is here, Kai is here, Kaden, Kingston, Oliver, Ronbeer, Alex. More people are showing up. Hi, guys. Good to see you all. As we have some more people come into the webinar, we're going to quickly recap what we were talking about yesterday. So we were talking about that there are multiple types of imaginative writing. We went over overstatement, which is when we exaggerate something. We talked about two ways that you can compare things, which are similes and metaphors. We talked about personification, which is when you take something that is not alive and you describe it using human characteristics or treat it as if it was alive. And we ended off talking about allusion. So allusion, because it can be a bit more complicated sometimes, I wanted to pick that up again. And at the end of yesterday, we were going to try to come up with some examples, write some of our own examples of allusion. And then today at the start, we're going to write those in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen and share some of those to see what everybody else said. So if anybody wants to type their answer in as we get started here, go for it. I'm going to just finish off the talking about allusion. So, all right. Oh, sorry about that. I got to get the right one up here. 1 second. Okay, while I work on getting my textbook up here, I'm going to read some of the examples that people are already putting into the Q&A box. So, Cassidy says that John and his crew crossed the river in the middle of the night, like Washington crossing the Delaware. That's a great example. That takes something from history, which is where George Washington and a group of soldiers had to cross over a river. And he's describing somebody in present time, John and his crew, doing the same thing. So that's a really good example because the tricky thing about allusion is that your reader kind of has to know what you're talking about. They have to know something from history, something from mythology, something from earlier works of art. If they don't know that earlier thing that you're talking about, then they might miss the reference that you're making right now. So we usually only want to use allusion with an audience that probably knows the type of reference we're going to make. If I was writing a children's story, I might not make the same kind of references that I would if I was going to write an article that is going to go into the New York Times for adults. If you're writing for an older or more educated audience, you can assume that they probably will know more history or more references than a very young audience. All right. So several people here are saying hi. Hi, guys. Good to see you again. Oh, another attendee says, sorry, I just joined. What are we talking about? So we're taking up some of the types of imaginative writing that we were talking about yesterday. And the last one that we talked about yesterday was called allusion. And just one more time, that's where you're trying to describe something in present time right now by comparing it to something that happened in the past. What we can do is we can take things that happened in history or things that happened in Greek mythology or Roman mythology or other stories that a lot of people are aware of, and you describe the current thing by comparing it to that older thing. So another example is, have you guys ever heard of Aesop's Fables? They're these ancient stories where animals do things and kind of teach us lessons about life. One really famous one is a story about a rabbit or a hare and a turtle that have a race. And as you probably remember, the rabbit goes really, really fast for half the race, and then he's so far ahead that he decides he can take a nap. So he goes to sleep, while the turtle just keeps on steadily moving along, and the turtle ends up winning the race. Well, you'll hear that story used a lot of times to describe things in kind of modern writing. Somebody might say something that, when studying, it's the tortoise that wins the race. You have to go, slow and steady the whole way. Don't try to rush through things. So if you'd never heard of that story before from Aesop's Fables, you might be like, why are we talking about turtles? What is going on? But whoever said that to you is probably expecting you to have heard that story before. So yeah, the word for that is allusion, allusion. It's just the comparing of something right now to something in the past that will kind of activate the imagination of your reader or your listener. So I hope that was helpful. All right, so Alex says, Joe painted like he was trying to capture Leonardo da Vinci's attention. That's a great example. That's taking a famous painter and saying that somebody in present time was trying to paint like that person. That's awesome. Anjali says, this is Isaiah, says, Max hit the ball as hard as Jackie Robinson. That's awesome. Taking a famous, excellent baseball player and saying somebody right now hit as hard as them. That's great. All right, good. So you guys feel free to keep on writing some more examples in there. And we're going to move on to our next example. Here we go. Our next type of imaginative writing is called irony. So, irony is stating one thing while meaning the opposite. And this can be to be funny or to express contempt or ridicule. So those are two kind of tough words there. So we're going to describe those really fast. Contempt is when you think you think very lowly of something. You might really dislike something, or you think that it's really bad, or that person is really dumb or something, and you just think very lowly of them. Or ridicule is when you are making fun of something. You're trying to say that, for whatever reason, you think it's bad and is deserving of being mocked. So in literature, writers will sometimes use irony to ridicule or show contempt for something. Here's some examples. Great weather we're having when it has been pouring for days, and one really means this weather is terrible, is irony. Irony comes from a Greek word meaning using words to hide something, or using words dishonestly. Irony is common in everyday speech. If someone says something you disagree with and you make a face and say, yeah, right, you are using obvious irony. It is easy to recognize irony in speech because of accompanying clues, such as the way it is said, with ridicule, for example, or gestures or facial expressions. Understanding irony in written form is a little more demanding because you don't have the visual clues. However, it is often clear that a statement contradicts the facts provided and so should be taken as irony. So again, we talked about yesterday, some of the examples of imaginative writing we're using are a little bit more complicated in today's lesson. And irony is one of them because it's kind of different from when we're talking about like metaphors and similes. We're just comparing two things to each other. We're saying her face was as bright as sunshine. That's like really, you can get that picture really easily. But when you're using irony, you're trying to activate the person's imagination by actually kind of saying the opposite of what you mean. And that can be tricky. Again, what they're saying there with when you see this in person, it can be a lot easier to understand because the person's facial expression or the way they say it or the way they sound, you might go like, oh, I get it. He's kind of, he's making a joke. He's making fun of something. And in literature, it's going to be a lot more straightforward. the author might just have the character say something, and the reader might get confused because it doesn't exactly make sense. In fact, the context of what's happening in the story, it might be the opposite of what that person is saying. So you have to be aware that irony is a type of imaginative writing and be on the lookout for that. This next part is taken from a book called The Whipping Boy, and it contains several instances of irony. A runaway prince named Brat, and he is a spoiled brat, has been captured by a lowly thief named Billy, who plans to ransom him for a handsome sum. And that means ransom is like the person that's been kidnapped. The person who kidnapped them wants to get paid to give them back. And a handsome sum there means basically just a lot of money. So the thief has captured this prince, and he's going to ask for a lot of money to send him back. So they go to Billy's home, and here's the part from the actual book. Billy pushed aside a low branch, revealing a rickety timbered hut with a moldy thatched roof. "There's your castle, your young majesty," he said, chuckling. "Accept our hospitality. I hope you won't mind sleeping on the floor." The floor was hard-packed earth. "I'm hungry," announced the prince. "And feast you will," said Billy. "Here's our finest bread and herring." It is the contradiction between the true situation and what he says about it that tells us Billy is speaking with irony. This passage is a good example of irony, as Billy is expressing contempt, ridicule, and humor all at once. There's a more general meaning of irony, referring to a situation where things are contrary to how they should be or to someone's intention or plan, and something is referred to as ironic when it is contrary to how it should be or how it should turn out. Here are some simple examples of situations that are ironic. A Great Dane, one of those really big dogs, a Great Dane cowers in a corner, terrified by the presence of a burglar. Or a fire station burns to the ground while the trucks are gone putting out another fire. In reality, Beethoven grew deaf and couldn't hear his own compositions. Mozart, a fabulous musical genius, died a pauper, that's a really poor person, and was buried in an unmarked grave. Ironic situations occur frequently in life, and literature tends to reflect this. So those are all examples of where you might expect something to go one way, and it goes the opposite way. This big dog that should be really scary and should chase away the burglar is whimpering in the corner. Just a fire station burning down, which does happen in real life occasionally, is usually described as being pretty ironic. All right. So this type of imaginative writing can be a bit tougher, but I want you guys at home to try to come up with your own examples of irony. So you could have the character in your example say the opposite of what they really mean, or you could just describe a situation of irony that you might encounter in a book. And as you guys write these down in the Q&A box, I'll read some of your examples. And while you guys write those, there's a few questions here in the Q&A box, so I'm going to go ahead and answer those. All right, so one viewer says, what does contradict mean? So that's where somebody says something and then somebody else says the opposite. If I said, the weather's really nice today, and then my friend goes, no, the weather's terrible today, he contradicted me. Some of the root of that word, where it comes from, contra means against. So you're basically, you're saying something against what somebody else said. Oh, and they ask about contrary. Contrary is a similar word. It's also saying something that's kind of the opposite, or like on the other side of what somebody said. All right. All right, so Alex says, here's an example of irony. Dylan saw an empty field strewn with trash and commented, prime real estate. Great. Jeffrey says, here's his example. "Look, a tree," said Tom. "What an astute observation," said Sally. So she is kind of ridiculing him for saying something pretty obvious. So yeah, as a writer, that would be using irony in your writing. Great example. Another viewer here says, "Is sarcasm irony?" Yeah, a character that's using sarcasm could be an example of irony in writing. Like that example with the thief that has captured the prince. He's being kind of sarcastic with what he's saying. He offered just some, fish and some bread, and he said, "This is our finest feast." Yeah, he's being sarcastic. He's saying something that he doesn't really mean. So. Milo says, "Way to be happy," he said to the person next to him, who was very sad. That's a good example. Another viewer here wants to go over just a little bit more what irony is. So irony is this overall, this whole type of imaginative writing where the real situation is one way, and the writer has somebody basically talk or describe it in a different way, usually the opposite way. If they walked up to a really tall mountain, the character might say like, "All right, time to go up this little hill here." They are basically saying the opposite of the way it really is. Giant mountain, and they describe it as like a little molehill. You might say, well, how does that help me imagine something? Because we're really saying the opposite of the way it is. Well, this type of imaginative writing is maybe kind of used more just to kind of give you a feeling. It doesn't really always give you a good picture. It's kind of more, it can be sort of descriptive or describing how a person acts or thinks or the way they talk or treat other people. So if a character in a story uses a lot of irony, if they do a lot of making fun of other characters in the story, if they often describe things the opposite of the way they really are, it probably gives you a good clue as to what kind of character they have. They're a person who maybe mocks other people a lot. Maybe there's somebody who looks at the whole world as a funny joke. You might have a character in a story that they always are trying to be honest and truthful and hopeful. And that's one type of character. And this other character is sort of sarcastic and mean, and he just uses irony a lot because he's kind of mad all the time. So he's often trying to ridicule other characters. In literature, you have your good guy characters and you have your bad guys. The author of the story might use irony a lot while they're describing a bad guy character, or maybe just a bad situation that the characters find themselves in. Normally when everything's going right and everybody's feeling good, the characters aren't usually sarcastic. But in a lot of books, when things are not going well, the characters might be feeling a little bit more mean, or they might be feeling a little bit more sarcastic about how things are going. You'll run into stories that they have characters using a lot more irony, and that's just something to be aware of so you can spot it when it's happening. All right, there's a few more examples here. Caden describes an ironic situation here. You have a beautiful beach, but the sand is too hot to walk on. Yeah, so that's the other type of irony, where you can just have a situation where you kind of expect things to be one way, and it turns out that they're the opposite way. This viewer says, a person disguises themselves as an ugly hag, that's like a witch, and their friend says, "You look great." Yeah, so that's being kind of sarcastic and saying the opposite of how it really is. This viewer says, it is time to surf this huge wave. I would imagine that the situation there would be if there was not a huge wave. Maybe it's just like a little ripple. They say, let's surf this huge wave. Yeah, that's irony because it's kind of the opposite of the way the situation really is. Kai here says, a bank is robbed while the cops are out getting donuts. Yep, that would be an ironic situation. All right. So you guys are putting a lot of great examples in there. Very good job. I'm reading them all, but we're going to move on to our next thing that we're going to do in the seminar today. So we are going to, I'm going to have you guys read some examples of imaginative writing. And most of these books are books that you would read probably like the upper middle school level, and some of them are like from a high school level. And again, we said we're going to challenge you a little bit more with some more challenging levels of writing that might have more words that you don't understand. So in that Q&A box, if you don't understand any of the words that we talk about here, feel free to ask in the Q&A box and we'll talk about those. But yeah, we're going to read some examples. This all comes from the Understanding Imaginative Writing course. We're going to read some of these, and I want you to figure out what kinds of imaginative writing it's using. So first focus on this one here, B. It says, since his daughter had died, Mr. Speak's heart had slowly frozen like a pond icing from the edges inward. So what type of imaginative writing is this using? We learned about overstatement or exaggeration. We learned about similes and metaphors yesterday. We learned about personification. We learned about allusion, and we learned about irony. So this character, it's saying that his heart had slowly frozen like a pond icing from the edges inward. Well, what does that mean? What type of imaginative writing is that using? And what is that imaginative writing saying? Feel free to, in the Q&A box, write down why you think they're trying to make that comparison. What are we describing, or how are we activating the imagination by using that example? All right, so some viewers are saying he's becoming cold and mean. Okay, good. Jeffrey says it's a simile. I think you're correct. We're describing one thing by saying it is like another thing. His heart was like a pond freezing from the outside inward. Jeffrey goes on to say, it's in order to describe his feelings of sadness and despair. I would agree with that. It's kind of a sad example. Cassidy also says that is a simile. Good job. Caden also says it's a simile. Awesome. Isaiah says that that is definitely imaginative writing. I agree. And another viewer says that it really makes it sound sad. I would agree. If we just kind of take a step back and look at the kind of simile that it's making, this writer here in this book decided to describe how this person feels by comparing it to a slowly freezing pond. That, you know, that they use imaginative writing there that brings up feelings of coldness, of something moving slowly. It can kind of activate your imagination and bring up these feelings that are like, they give you a bigger picture. They paint a bigger picture than if it just said, he felt very sad. All right, let's see if we can find an example with a little bit more action or a little bit of a different feeling to it. All right, let's look at this sentence E. The bear moved with incredible speed. He crashed through thickets that slowed the dogs. He was like a steamboat on the river, and the dense tangle of briars and thorny vines and fallen logs was no more than a fluid current under him. All right, here's one of those tougher examples. This might have a few more words in there that we have to learn what the words mean. So go ahead and ask if you want us to define any of those. Let's go through it one more time. Let's try to figure out what kind of imaginative writing we're using here and what is it really communicating by saying this. The bear moved with incredible speed. I think that part sounds like plain writing, but this next part has some pretty imaginative writing. He crashed through thickets that slowed the dogs. He was like a steamboat on the river, and the dense tangle of briars and thorny vines and fallen logs was no more than a fluid current under him. So what type of imaginative writing is that, and what are they saying there? All right. One viewer says, what does thickets mean? Thickets here is like, they're talking about very dense areas of like trees and plants. A thicket is usually an area that's got like a lot of like trees and vegetation like growing together. So it's saying that the bear is crashing through all these plants and trees like a steamboat on a river. Now, what would that part mean? Like a steamboat on a river? Isaiah says, I like that example very much. It was so cool. And he got it. Awesome. Thanks, Isaiah. All right, so Milo says, that's a simile. You're right. Because again, it uses that clue word there. When it says that the bear was like a steamboat, we're taking something and comparing it to something else that we may have seen before. Cassidy says it is another simile. It is saying that the thickets and thorny vines did not slow him down at all. Yeah, I think you make a good point there. Yeah, a lot of other viewers are saying it's a simile too. So let's figure out, let's look really quickly at why that's a simile and what it's saying. So yeah, it says he was like a steamboat on the river. So for me, what that makes me imagine is that when you have a boat on a river, there's usually just water in front of it. I mean, there might be like a rock or something sticking out every here and there, but the boat is going to try to avoid those. If it's just open water in front of a boat, that boat can just move forward across the water with nothing in front of it. It's the easiest thing in the world for a boat to just move straight forward, right? So if this bear is crashing through trees and plants that slowed the dogs, but the bear is like a steamboat on a river, and the dense tangle of briars and thorny vines and fallen logs, these are like, we have like, there's thorns and there's vines. There's like maybe blackberry bushes and all kinds of plants. There's big trees that fell over, but they're no more than a fluid current under him. So it's like we have a river. That's what they mean by fluid current there. And this bear is just moving through this dense forest like it's a boat on a river. For me, at least, that gives me this like strong, imaginative picture of how powerful and fast this bear is. If I was in a forest and a bear was coming at me through dense forest like a steamboat on a river, I would be scared. That little snippet of writing there really gets my imagination thinking about how fast this bear is moving. And it's like action-packed. It's almost a little bit scary the way he describes it. Let's see what else you guys said about it. Oh, well, one viewer says, they're saying, aren't steamboats slow? Well, yeah, I would agree with that. I think they can, but the context of this book is that I believe it takes place in Florida or somewhere in the South, where this is probably a type of boat that the character in the book has actually seen before. And no matter how fast the boat moves, when a boat starts moving on a river, I mean, there's nothing stopping it. It's just kind of, chugging forward. The steamboat would just move. It's like a big, vehicle, these steamboats, and nothing would really stop them once they go forward. So I think that's the, kind of the context of the character. Maybe a more modern book might say like a speedboat on a river. I mean, the author could say that if it was written today, probably. All right. Caden says, yeah, it's a simile because the bear, nothing can stop him. I agree. And Alex says, it was like they either sped the bear up or it made no difference. He just cruised right along. Yeah, I agree with that. Nunjali says that that's definitely imaginative writing. So awesome. All right, let's go over another example. All right, here we go. C here. The wind had been high overhead. The rain was a solid wall from sky to earth. Jody struck it flat, as though he had dived against it from a great height. So just in that first part there's actually going to be more than one type of imaginative writing here. So when you guys write in the Q&A box, you can say which part of this quote here you're talking about, because there's going to be several different types that you could pick to talk about. A second wind, here we go. It hurled him back and threw him off his balance. A second wind seemed now to reach long muscular fingers through the wall of rain and scoop up everything in its path. It reached down his shirt and into his mouth and eyes and ears and tried to strangle him. Wow, a lot happened there in that paragraph. Let's read it one more time. The wind had been high overhead. The rain was a solid wall from sky to earth. Jody struck it flat, as though he had dived against it from a great height. It hurled him back and threw him off his balance. A second wind seemed now to reach long muscular fingers through the wall of rain and scoop up everything in its path. It reached down his shirt and into his mouth and eyes and ears and tried to strangle him. All right, so there's more than one type of imaginative writing there. So in the Q&A box, pick which one you want to talk about and tell us what you think it's describing. And yeah, definitely say which part in the Q&A box, because I think you could probably pick from like at least 4 different things there. Isaiah wants to say, good job, you guys, on all the other commenters and viewers that have been saying things. And I agree, you guys are doing a great job. All right, Cassidy says, when it says the rain was a solid wall, that is a metaphor. I agree, because it doesn't say that the rain was like a wall. They just say the rain was a solid wall. But rain can't really be a wall, so that's definitely a metaphor. We're saying that something is something else. Now, in my imagination, that makes me think the rain is coming down so hard, it feels almost like there's a solid surface there. I think they do a great job with that. Yeah, and Cassidy also says, it is saying that there was so much rain that it was like a wall. Yeah, exactly. Kai says, it sounds like one of the robed ghost things from Harry Potter, sucking the life out of him. Yeah. I think Kai's talking about the Dementors from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which in its own way, your answer is a form of allusion. You're comparing what's happening in this book here to something else that a lot of us have read before. So very good job. But when they say, though, that the wind reached its fingers and all that stuff that it's saying there, what type of imaginative writing is that? Let's take another look at that part. So right here, the rain was a solid wall from sky to earth. So that is a metaphor. It's just straight up saying that the rain was a wall. It's not really, but that really makes us use our imagination. It's describing it in a way that it tells us how much rain there was, how strong it was, etc. And then it says Jody struck it flat, kind of like you can run into a wall. You can't normally run into rain really, but if it's really strong and you hit that rain, it might feel as though he had dived against it from a great height. I think it's almost like they're comparing it to, imagine you're jumping off of a really high diving board into a pool and you hit the water. And, you know, if anybody's ever belly flopped off of a diving board, it's almost like they're saying that's what it feels like to get hit with this rain. All right. So that's the first part. We have a great metaphor there. Oh, in this part, as though he had dived, that's a simile. So this writer's using a lot of different types. They have a metaphor, and then they have a simile. But then it says, a second wind seemed now to reach long muscular fingers through the wall of rain. So does wind really have fingers? I don't think so. So if we're describing the wind as having fingers, and then we say that the wind reached down his shirt and into his mouth and eyes and ears and tried to strangle him, what does that mean? What kind of imaginative writing is that? Did anybody spot that part? Let's check the Q&A box again. So Cassidy says, when it says that it reached down his shirt and tried to strangle him, that is personification. Good job, Cassidy, you are right. They go on to say, rain can't actually strangle someone. I agree. So if we're treating the weather like it can reach out and strangle you, we're treating the weather like it's alive, like it's a person or a thing that can actually take actions and think and do things. It can't really, but by describing it that way, it's almost like we're treating the weather like it's another character. We're treating the weather like it's alive and maybe it's angry or that it doesn't like the characters in the book and that's going to do things to them. It can make a lot more feeling of excitement and tension to make it feel like there's somebody that the character's going up against. If they just said, oh, man, reader, it was raining so hard. Jody had never seen it rain so hard. It's like, okay. That's not very interesting. Treating the weather like it's alive and that it's trying to strangle this guy, Jody, that's exciting. I want to know what's going to happen next. Isaiah says he really likes your comparison to Harry Potter. He loves that book. Anjali also says, I think that they're saying it's like when a hose hits you so hard it hurts. Yeah, that is a great simile, by the way. That's a great comparison. Another viewer asks if the viewers at home can see the things that the other people are saying. No, the Q&A box, when people type that in, it's only the person running the seminar that can see it. Yeah, so I'm just reading off some of the answers to you guys. All right, so Anjali also says, yep, that was personification. Isaiah sees that it's also personification. And I'm glad you're enjoying the class. That's really awesome. Thank you. All right. I think we have time for one more example before we have to go. Let's find a good one. All right. That last example was from a book called The Yearling. We're going to do, yeah, let's do one more here from the same book. I think this one's a good example too, because it can be, they're going to use something that happened the other day. Somebody read an example where the spelling of what it said wasn't exactly right. The spelling in the book, it said kin, K-I-N, when they really meant can. That's not like officially one of the types of imaginative writing we're using, but it could almost fit under the same topic because the writer was writing in a certain way to kind of make you hear how the character talked. And they do that again here. All right. Penny Baxter had grown to maturity, no bigger than a boy. His feet were small, his shoulders narrow, his ribs and hips jointed together in a continuous, fragile framework. He had stood among the foresters one day. That's a family of people in this book. He had stood among the foresters one day like an ash sapling among giant oaks. Lem Forrester looked down at him and said, "Why, you little old penny piece, you're good money, all right, but it just don't come no smaller. Little old Penny Baxter. The name had been his only one ever since. All right, so let's go through this, and first off, we're going to define what a few of these words mean to make sure that we're all on the same page about what it's saying. Okay, so this character's name, his nickname is Penny. Penny Baxter had grown to maturity. So maturity just means when you're grown up. Maturity, when you mature. This is an adult man that we're talking about, but it says that he is no bigger than a boy. His feet were small, his shoulders narrow, his ribs, this part, your ribs here, and hips, lower down, top of your leg area. It says that they're jointed together in a continuous, fragile framework. So the framework of something, kind of the frame of how it's built, maybe it's talking about his bones there. It's saying that he's fragile, which means that it breaks easily. Maybe it looks very much like it could break easily. So you have this grown man, but he's as small as a boy, and everything about his body, his feet, his shoulders, his ribs, and everything, they look small and fragile. I'm already, just from the plain writing, I'm getting a pretty good imaginative idea of what they're saying about this character. But here's the first piece of, really one of the types of imaginative writing that we were going over. He had stood among the foresters one day, like an ash sapling among giant oaks. So ash and oak, those are just different types of trees. You could go on Google Images and look up a picture of what an ash tree looks like and what an oak tree looks like if you haven't seen one before. But a sapling is like a young tree. It's a little baby tree that's just starting to grow. They're usually like the trunks are like really skinny. So they're saying here, he had stood among the foresters, this other family, one day like an ash sapling among giant oaks. What type of imaginative writing is that? And then it says, this character, Lem Forrester, looks down at him and says, "Why, you little old penny piece, you. You're good money, all right, but it just don't come no smaller. Leetle old Penny Baxter." So, leetle, what word do we think he's saying there? That's not the correct spelling for any word. I think when they're saying leetle, it's just his funny pronunciation of the word little. So you little old penny piece, you. You're good money, but it just don't come no smaller. Little old Penny Baxter. So this isn't the author describing the characters with imaginative writing. The author is actually having one of the characters describe another character with imaginative writing. What type of imaginative writing is that character using to describe the other character? Let's see what we think here. All right, so Kai and another attendee both say that it's a simile, the first part. Do we agree? Let's see what it said. So he had stood among the foresters like an ash sapling among giant oaks. Yeah, so we have that clue word there, like an ash sapling among giant oaks. So that's definitely a simile. We can imagine a very small little skinny tree that's very like a little baby tree next to giant oak trees. And we get the picture of little Penny Baxter next to the Foresters family. It's a good job. That is a simile. And what's the next part? Cassidy also says the tree part is a simile. Good job. It's saying that he is small compared to the Foresters. I agree. Yeah, and Kai also points out that, yep, this is a comparison here. Good job. Milo also says it's a simile, the part with the sapling. Yeah. Yeah, another commenter here is saying like little. Yeah, it's a pretty odd way of describing it. I agree. So you guys are totally right about that. We have just a minute left. Can we figure out what is the other part there? When one of the Foresters is saying, "You're good money, but it just don't come no smaller." What is he saying? A person can't literally be money. So what type of imaginative writing is that? What type of writing is it if the character is saying, "You are money. Well, he's not literally money, but if we had some coins in our hand, what's one of the main things about a coin? So Cassidy is saying the next part is a metaphor. I agree. He's saying that he is a small piece of money. Yeah. So they're making a comparison there of saying that this guy is so small, it's like he's a little penny in your hand. I don't know about you guys, but if I was Penny Baxter, I would be pretty annoyed at being described this way. So yeah, that's a metaphor. And it sounds like in the story, this metaphor was so good for the listeners that it stuck. Whatever the guy's name was before, this other character describes him as a penny, and everybody's like, oh yeah, a penny for sure. And they just called him Penny Baxter from then on. So if you need an example of the power of imaginative writing and speaking, there you go. So, all right, that is the end of all the types of imaginative writing that we were going to cover. I'm glad you guys enjoyed it. Several people in the Q&A box there said that they really loved learning about this. I appreciate that. I'm really glad to hear that, guys. I've really enjoyed teaching this class. This is our last one for the week. This has been our second week of these webinars, and we've really enjoyed teaching them. I hope you have all really enjoyed partaking in them, participating. So we're going to be back next week with a whole nother schedule of more webinars. You can look at the schedule on delphian.org and see all the next ones that we're going to be doing. And you can start registering for those right now, but we will see all of you on Monday morning. So see you guys later.